On Christmas morning, I stood in the doorway of my own home and watched my mother hand a stranger the keys. She was smiling. My father was nodding. And neither of them saw me standing there in the snow, because they had stopped looking for me a long time ago. My name is Élise Moreau. I'm 37 years old, and what happened that December changed everything. Not just for me, but for every person in that house who thought silence meant consent. 2 years ago, on December 25th, I drove 4 hours through a Minnesota snowstorm to spend the holidays with my family, only to arrive at the house I had legally owned for 6 years and find my parents in the middle of transferring possession of it to my younger brother, Ryan, and his girlfriend of 8 months. They had told him the house was theirs to move into. They had coordinated a move. There were boxes in the hallway and a moving truck idling in the driveway. What they didn't know was that I had a copy of the deed in my glove compartment, and that I had carried it with me for 3 months, ever since I overheard a phone call I was never supposed to hear. But before I tell you what happened in that kitchen on Christmas morning, I need to take you back with me to the spring of 2017, to a gray Tuesday afternoon in Minneapolis, when my grandmother, Rose, pulled me aside at her kitchen table and pressed something into my hands that I wouldn't fully understand for another 5 years. Before I continue, if this story is already pulling at something in you, that particular knot in the chest you get when family and betrayal arrive in the same sentence, take a moment to subscribe. Only if you feel it, though. And drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I genuinely love knowing who's on the other side of the screen. Now let me take you back. I grew up in a 4-bedroom house outside of St. Paul, the oldest of 3 children. My brother Ryan is 5 years younger than me, and my sister Monica is 8 years younger. From the time I was old enough to notice these things, I noticed that the rules in our house had a particular shape. They bent toward Ryan. Not dramatically, not in ways that invited confrontation, but consistently in the small daily currency of family life. The last slice of pie, the car on Friday nights, the college fund conversation that somehow only ever involved one child's name. My mother, Linda, loved all 3 of us. I have never doubted that. But she loved Ryan in a different register, the way some people love a fragile thing they are afraid to lose. My father, Gerald, followed her lead in most things, which meant that what she decided, he confirmed. I became early on the daughter who handled things herself. I worked through college, graduated with an accounting degree from the University of Minnesota in 2009. And by the time I was 29, I was a senior financial analyst at a firm in downtown Minneapolis, making $94,000 a year and saving aggressively. In 2018, when I was 33, I purchased a 2-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood in South Minneapolis. $287,000, 20% down, everything clean and documented and mine. I had the deed recorded with Hennepin County on March 8, 2018. I have never once been late on a mortgage payment. My grandmother Rose had watched all of this with quiet satisfaction. She was 74 when I bought that house, still sharp, still the kind of woman who noticed everything and said very little until she had something worth saying. The afternoon she pulled me aside at her kitchen table, she had just made coffee. I can still smell it. Dark roast with a hint of chicory, the way she always made it. And she placed a sealed envelope on the table between us. "Keep this somewhere safe," she told me. "Not in this house. Not where anyone can find it without asking you first." I asked her what it was. She looked at me over the rim of her mug and said, "Insurance against the people who love you wrong." I didn't know what she meant. Not fully. Not for another 4.5 years. What was in the envelope was a handwritten letter from my grandmother, dated and notarized, along with a copy of the deed to her own property, a lake cabin in northern Minnesota that she had quietly transferred into my name in 2016, 2 years before she told me about it. The transfer was legal, recorded, complete. She had told no one else. Some things, she had written in the letter, should belong to the person who will actually take care of them. I kept the envelope in a fireproof box in my closet. I thought about it sometimes, turning it over in my mind the way you turn over a stone you found in a strange place. I didn't understand why she had felt it necessary. I understood in September of 2022, when I was sitting in my car in a parking garage after a long Thursday at the office, and I accidentally answered a call that was meant to go to voicemail. It was my mother. She didn't realize I'd picked up. I heard my father's voice in the background, and then Ryan's, and I sat completely still for 4 minutes and 23 seconds, while I listened to my mother explain to my brother that she had a plan for my house, that she and my father had been struggling financially, something I had not been told, and that they had decided the solution was to move Ryan and his girlfriend Kayla into my home, not as renters, as occupants. She used the word transition. She said, "Élise won't fight us on this. She never fights us on anything." I didn't say a word. I waited until the call ended. Then I sat in that parking garage for 11 minutes in complete silence, listening to the hum of fluorescent lights overhead, and I made a decision. I called my attorney, Margot Chen, the next morning. I had worked with Margot for 4 years on various financial matters, and she was methodical, unflappable, and exactly what I needed. I brought her the deed, the mortgage statements, and a recording I had made of the tail end of that phone call. Minnesota is a one-party consent state, and I had hit record the moment I understood what I was hearing. Margot reviewed everything in a meeting that lasted 1 hour and 40 minutes, and when she set down her pen, she looked at me and said, "Élise, your ownership of this property is not in question. Not legally, not remotely." She drafted 2 documents for me, a formal trespass notice, prepared and ready to file, and a cease and desist letter addressed to my parents. We agreed I would hold both until I had a clearer picture of how far my parents intended to take this. What they intended, it turned out, was to take it all the way to Christmas. I need to pause here for a second. If you can feel what I was feeling in those 3 months, that particular stillness that comes not from peace, but from certainty, when you've stopped hoping people will choose differently and started simply watching, type "I understand" in the comments. Because that feeling is its own kind of knowledge, and I think many of you know exactly what I mean. Through October and November, I watched. I visited my parents twice, and both times I arrived to find small signs of the plan in motion. A conversation about Ryan's lease ending in January. A casual mention of how the South Minneapolis neighborhood had really improved. My mother asking once, offhandedly, whether I had thought about what I'd do if I needed to move for work. I answered everything calmly. I watched everything carefully. Ryan himself, to be fair, seemed partially convinced that my parents had some kind of arrangement with me, that I had agreed to something he hadn't been told the details of. I didn't correct that impression. I needed to see how far the plan had been taken before I showed anyone my hand. Then came December 25th. I arrived at my parents' house at 11:15 in the morning, having driven through 4 hours of a snowstorm, to find a moving truck in my driveway and my brother and Kayla carrying boxes through the front door. My mother was in the kitchen directing the operation with the particular energy she reserves for projects she has fully convinced herself are reasonable. My father was in the living room, watching football with the volume low, doing what he has done in difficult moments my entire life, pretending not to see. I stood in the doorway for a moment. The house smelled like pine and coffee, and the particular cold of a door left open too many times in winter. I counted to 7. Then I walked into the kitchen and set my bag down on the counter and looked at my mother. "Can we talk about what's happening?" I asked. She turned around with a smile that was already prepared. "Oh, good, you're here. I was going to call you. Élise, your father and I thought this made the most sense. Ryan needs a stable place, and you're so established, you can always—" "Mom," I said, quietly. Whose name is on the deed to this house? The smile held for another 2 seconds, then it began to soften at the edges. I reached into my coat pocket and unfolded the document I had carried with me for 3 months. I set it on the kitchen counter between us. The recorded deed from Hennepin County, dated March 8, 2018, with my full legal name printed clearly on line 4. I had also brought the cease and desist letter Margot had prepared, and I set that beside it. "The deed is mine," I said. "The mortgage is mine. The property taxes for the last 6 years are mine. There is no arrangement. There was never a conversation. And this letter is from my attorney, which explains in specific legal terms what happens next if those boxes don't leave this property today." My father had come to stand in the kitchen doorway. The color had drained from his face so completely that he looked like a man watching something he had been certain would hold, simply stop holding. My mother's hands had gone to the edge of the counter. She was gripping it, not dramatically, just tightly, in the way people grip things when they need to be sure the floor is still there. Ryan appeared behind my father. He read the room in about 4 seconds, and to his credit, he looked, genuinely, like someone who had just understood that he had been told a version of events that wasn't true. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I thought of my grandmother Rose, at her kitchen table 7 years earlier, saying, "Insurance against the people who love you wrong." And I understood, finally and completely, what she had seen coming that I had refused to. "I'm not angry," I told my mother, and I meant it. "But I am finished being managed." By the end of that afternoon, the moving truck had been unloaded and driven away. Ryan and Kayla were in their car. My father had sat at the kitchen table for a long time without speaking, and then he had said, quietly, "We made a mistake." It was the most direct thing he had said to me in years. I told him I knew. I told him I needed him to say it to Ryan, too. The weeks that followed were not simple. My mother went through a period of wounded silence that lasted about 3 weeks, during which she sent 3 texts that were written in the particular language of people who want credit for not screaming. My sister Monica, who had watched the family dynamics her whole life and said almost nothing, called me on December 28th and talked for 47 minutes, the longest conversation we'd had since college. She said, "I always knew you knew more than you said." I told her our grandmother had taught me that. Ryan came to me separately, in January, and that conversation was the hardest one. Not because he was cruel, he wasn't, but because he had genuinely been told a story, and learning that story wasn't true required him to look at our parents with new eyes, which is a painful and disorienting thing at any age. I told him that none of what happened was about him and me. I told him that the house was mine, that it would remain mine, and that if he ever needed something real, practical help, honest conversation, he could ask me directly. He thanked me. I believe him. My parents and I have spent the past 8 months rebuilding something that requires us to be more honest than we've been before. It's slower than reconciliation looks in most stories. My mother made a genuine apology in February, in person, at her kitchen table, which smelled like dark roast and chicory, which made me think of Rose, which made me cry in a way I hadn't expected. I told her I accepted it. I told her the condition was simply this: if something involves me, I am part of the conversation. She agreed. I am in my house right now, at my own kitchen table, with coffee going and winter light coming through the south window at a low January angle that turns everything pale gold. It is quiet. It is mine. 6 years of mortgage payments and property taxes and weekends spent fixing what needed fixing, and it is still, simply, mine. What I want to say to you, whoever you are, wherever you're listening from, is this: documentation is not distrust. Knowing what belongs to you is not aggression. The people who love us sometimes develop a habit of making decisions on our behalf because they have learned, over years, that we will absorb the cost quietly. The moment you stop absorbing it, they discover the actual shape of the arrangement they had created. That discovery is hard for everyone. It is still necessary. My grandmother Rose knew something that took me until I was 37 to fully apply. Preparation is not paranoia. A deed in your glove compartment is not a weapon. It is simply evidence that you know what is yours. If this story resonated with you, tell me in the comments. Have you ever had to show documentation to reclaim something that was always rightfully yours? I read every single comment. If you know someone who needs to hear this today, please share it with them. And if you're new here, subscribe. There is another story waiting for you in the description, and I'll be back very soon. Thank you for being here all the way to the end. I'll see you soon.